The Zend Avesta, the Vendidad, translated by James Darmesteter, The Sacred Books of the East, Volume 4, Oxford Press, 1880. The discovery of the Zend Avesta. The Zend Avesta is the sacred book of the Parsis, that is to say, of the few remaining followers of that religion which feigned over Persia at the time when the second successor of Muhammad, Umar, overthrew the Sassanian dynasty. At the Battle of Nihavand in 642 of the Common Era, and which has been called dualism or Mazdaism or Magism or Zoroastrianism or fire worship, although they never worship the fire, according to, as its main tenet, are its supreme god, Ahura Mazda, are its priests, are its supposed founder, are its apparent object of worship, has been most kept in view. Zarathustra didn't like religious founders, and he refused to, he didn't want a sect. He didn't want to be considered the founder of a sect. He didn't want to start his own way. He just wanted to revive what was. But Mazda Yesnaha Zarathustra is the real name of the religion. And less than a century after their defeat, nearly all the conquered peoples were brought over to the faith of their new rulers, either by force or policy or the attractive power of a simpler form of creed. But many of those who clung to the faith of their fathers went and sought abroad for a new home where they might freely worship their old gods and say their old prayers. Now, Zarathustra was probably monotheist, but a bunch of angel worship made its way into what people call Zoroastrianism, and performed their old rites. At home they found, at last, among the tolerant Hindus on the west coast of India and in the peninsula of Gujarat. And they settled first at Sangan, not far from Daman. Hence they spread over Surat, Navsari, Borak, Cambay. Within the last 2 centuries, well, add another century now, they have settled at Bombay, which now contains the bulk of the Parsi people, nearly 150,000 souls. In the late 1700s, it is said they still numbered nearly 100,000 souls, but now remain no more than 8,000 or 9,000 souls scattered in Yezd and the surrounding villages, according to Dasaboy Framji, the Parsis. There they throve, and there they still live, while the ranks of their co-religionists in Persia are daily thinning and dwindling away. Islam itself allowed people to have whatever religion, but the next of kin marriage, the forced marriage, the trying to seek out and kill whatever species they didn't like, this was not allowed to the Persian people by the Muslim rulers. As the Parsis are the ruins of a people, so are their sacred books the ruins of a religion. There has been no other great belief in the world that ever left such poor and meager monuments of its past splendor. Yet great is the value which that small book, the Avesta, and the belief of that scanty people, the Parsis, have in the eyes of the historian and theologist, as they present to us the last reflex of the ideas which prevailed in Iran during the 5 centuries which preceded, and the 7th which followed, and the 7 which followed the birth of Christ, which, if you look into it historically, is probably a century before the Christians say, a period which led up to be like 4 or 5, years, like 80, 100, or, probably about 100 years before the Christians say, but a period which gave to the world the Gospels, the Talmud, and the Quran. Persia, it is known, had much influence on each of the movements which produced or proceeded from those 3 books. She lent much to the first heresiarchs, much to the rabbis, and much to Muhammad, who also abhorred the idea of founding religions and condemned those who did such things. By help of the Parsi religion and of the Avesta, we are enabled to go back to the very heart of that most momentous period in the history of religious thought, which saw the blending of the Aryan mind with the Semitic, and thus opened the second stage of Aryan thought. Now, around 4,000 years ago is actually a pretty probable date for Zarathustra. But it's also possible that the Magian people had a revival. There's linguistic and other clues, and even sayings about how far back he was, that put it at an earlier date. I don't think it's appropriate to say that a Achaemenid revival was right after right after Zarathustra was around. Inquiries into the religion of ancient Persia began long ago, and it was the old foe of Persia, the Greek, who first studied it. Aristotle, his Diogenes Laertius, Proemium 8, Hermippus, according to Pliny's history, narrative 31:2, and many others, like Dinon, Theopompus, Hermodorus, and Heraclitus Commanus, wrote of it in books, of which, unfortunately, nothing more than a few fragments, or merely the titles, have come down to us. We find much valuable information about it scattered in the accounts of historians and travelers, extending over 10 centuries from Herodotus down to Agathias and Procopius. It was never more eagerly studied than in the first centuries of the Christian era, but that study had no longer anything of the disinterested and almost scientific character it had in earlier times. Well, perhaps after Alexander the Great and that destruction prompted interest. And what's this religion that we destroy, that the remains of were destroyed? Religious and philosophic sects in search of new dogmas eagerly received whatever came to them bearing the name of Zoroaster. Yeah, there was a lot of pseudo stuff, I guess, in the early Christian centuries. As Xanthus and Lydian, who it is said to have lived before Herodotus, had mentioned the Zoroastrian Ragia according to the Nicalos Damascensis Ditot fragment. There came to light in those later times scores of oracles, styled logia tu zor o as true, or oracula chaldaica siva magica, the work of Neoplatonists who were but very remote disciples of the Median sage. As his name had become the very emblem of wisdom, they would cover it with the latest inventions of their ever-deepening theosophy. Zoroaster and Plato were treated as if they had been philosophers in the same school, and Hierocles expounded their doctrines in the same book. Proclus collected 70 tetrads of Zoroaster and wrote commentaries on them. But we need hardly say that Zoroaster, commented on by Proclus, was nothing more or less than Proclus commented on by Proclus. And yes, it's like people in Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra is, not about, it's not trying to retell it's in a way it's trying to retell the Zoroastrian religion. But what if Zoroaster was, using him as a symbol? But yeah, it's, it's not authentic tradition of the tradition, right? In any sense. Perdicus, the Gnostic, had secret books of Zoroaster, and upon the whole, it may be said in the first centuries of Christianity, the religion of Persia was more studied and less understood than it had ever been before. The real object aimed at in studying the old religion was to form a new one. Throughout the Middle Ages, nothing was known of Mazdaism, but the name of its founder, who, from a magus, was converted into a magician and master of the hidden sciences. It was not until the Renaissance that the real inquiry was resumed. The first step was to collect all the information that could be gathered from Greek and Roman writers. The task was undertaken and successfully completed by Barnabé Bresson. A near approach to the original source was made in the following century by Italian, English, and French travelers in Asia. Pietro della Valle, Henry Lord, Mandelslow, Ovington, Chardin, Gabriel du Chinon, and Tavernier found Zoroaster's last followers in Persia and India, and made known their existence, their manners, and the main features of their belief to Europe. Gabriel du Chinon saw their books and recognized that they were not all written in the same language, the original Holy Writ being no longer understood except by means of translations and commentaries in another tongue. The Yazidi and some of the other people are pretty much only known in translation. So, and people say, oh, but they're of whatever faith the book is. It's like, no, they're not. And really, unless you're talking about Enochian or something, or then, in the year 1700, a professor at Oxford, Thomas Hyde, the greatest Orientalist of his time in Europe, made the first systematic attempt to restore the history of the old Persian religion by combining the accounts of the Muslim writers with the true and genuine monuments of ancient Persia. Unfortunately, the so-called genuine monuments of ancient Persia were nothing more than recent compilations referring to the last stage of Parsyism. But notwithstanding this defect, which could hardly be avoided then, and notwithstanding its still worse fault, a strange want of critical acumen, the book of Thomas Hyde was the first complete and true picture of modern Parsyism, and it made inquiry into its history the order of the day. Thus he recognized Abraham as the first lawgiver of ancient Persia, and Magiism, Sabian corruption of the primal faith, and in Zoroaster held they had learnt the forgotten truth from the exiled Jews of Babylon. Historical Judaism is after 540, so that, overthrows that in a way, and there's reason to think that Abraham was after Zoroaster. A warm appeal made by him to the zeal of travelers to seek for and procure at any price the sacred books of the Parsees did not remain ineffectual, and from that time scholars bethought themselves of studying Parsyism in its own home. 18 years later, a countryman of Hyde, George Boker, received from the Parsees in Surat a copy of the Vendidad Sada, which was brought to England in 1723 by Richard Cobbe. But the old manuscript was a sealed book, and the most that could be then made of it was to hang it by an iron chain to the wall of the Bodleian Library, as a curiosity to be shown to foreigners. A few years later, a Scottish man named Fraser went to Surat with the view of obtaining from the Parsees not only their books, but also a knowledge of their contents. He was not very successful in the first undertaking, and utterly failed in the second. In 1754, a young man, 20 years old, Inquitil Duperon, a scholar of the École des Langues Orientales in Paris, happened to see a facsimile of 4 leaves of the Oxford Vendidad, which had been sent from England a few years before to Etienne Formant, the Orientalist. He determined at once to give to France both the books and the first European translation of them. Impatient to set off, without waiting for a mission from the government which had been promised to him, he enlisted as a private soldier in the service of the French East India Company. He embarked at Lorient on the 24th of February, 1755. Out of 3 years of endless adventures and dangers through the whole breadth of Hindustan, at the very time when war was raging between France and England, he arrived at last in Surat, where he stayed among the Parsees for 3 years more. Here began another struggle, not less hard, but more decisive, against the mistrust and ill will of the Parsees, which had disheartened Fraser. But he came out of it victorious, and succeeded at last in winning from the Parsees both their books and their knowledge. He came back to Paris on the 14th of March, 1764, and deposited on the following day at Bibliothèque Royale the whole of the Zend Avesta and copies of most of the traditional books. He spent 10 years in studying the material he had collected, and published in 1771 the first European translation of the Zend Avesta. A violent dispute broke out at once, as half the learned world denied the authenticity of the Avesta, which it pronounced a forgery. It was the future founder of the Royal Asiatic Society, William Jones, a young Oxonian then, who opened the war. He had been wounded to the quick by the scornful tone adopted by and Quintil towards Hyde, and a few other English scholars. The Zend Avesta suffered for the fault of its introducer, Zoroaster for Anquetil, in a pamphlet written in French, with a verve and in a style which showed him to be a good disciple of Voltaire. W. Jones pointed out and dwelt upon the oddities and obscurities with which the so-called sacred books of Zoroaster teemed. It is true that Anquetil had given full scope to satire by the style he had adopted. He cared very little for literary elegance, and did not mind writing Zend and Persian in French. So, the new and strange ideas he had to express looked stranger still in the outlandish garb he gave them. Yet it was less the style than the ideas that shocked the contemporary of Voltaire. His main argument was that books full of such silly tales of laws and rules, so absurd of descriptions of gods and demons, so grotesque, could not be the work of a sage like Zoroaster, nor the code of a religion much celebrated for its simplicity, wisdom, and purity. The conclusion was that the Avesta was a rhapsody of some modern goober. In fact, the only thing in which Jones succeeded was to prove in a decisive manner that the ancient Persians were not equal to the Lumières of the 18th century, and that the authors of the Avesta had not read the Encyclopédie. Yeah, it's quite an overstatement. Just because it says that other things exist doesn't mean that they're gods, although, people treat things as gods, which has led to a lot of confusion. Deva is not a god, but people certainly chose angels to call upon in the East. And, well, I'm not using the Ahuras weren't. But the religion at its base was supposed to be that somebody, anybody could follow. But certainly the professional priesthood made it into something else. And then it made it so people accepted other claims to religion that came in, rather than what was probably part of the same old religion, just different dispensations, same father, different mothers. Jones' censure was echoed in England by Sir John Charton and Richardson in Germany by miners. Richardson tried to give a scientific character to the attacks of Jones by founding them on philological grounds. That Avesta was a fabrication of modern times was shown, he argued, by the number of Arabic words he fancied he found both in the Zend and the Pahlavi dialects, as no Arabic element was introduced into the Persian idiom earlier than the 7th century. Well, you could say that the Persian influenced the Arabic, the founding of the Arabic, Farsi, but the older Persian languages certainly connected to the Semitic ones to a degree. Also by the harsh texture of the Zend, contrasted with the rare euphony of the Persian. And lastly, by the radical difference between the Zend and the Persian, both in words and grammar. To these objections, drawn from the form, he added another derived from the uncommon stupidity of the matter. Now we call the language Avestan, but in Germany, miners to the charges brought against the newfound books added another of a new and unexpected kind, namely that they spoke of ideas unheard of before, and made known new things. Pray, who would dare ascribe to Zoroaster books in which there are found numberless names of trees, animals, men, and demons unknown to the ancient Persians? in which are invoked an incredible number of pure animals and other things, which, as appear in the silence of other writers, were never known, or at least never worshipped in Persia. Well, some of the things mentioned in the Bible turn out to be ancient Persian texts that are, some of them are bigger than the Bible. So claiming, well, I know every entity and whatnot that was known in ancient Persia, and you don't even read what's there, and I don't think most of what's there is actually even readily available in translation. So, what Greek ever spoke of Home, of Jemshid, and of other such personages as the fabricators of that rhapsody exalt with every kind of praise as divine heroes? Except if we look at translation. Yes, they definitely do know about the plant. They definitely did know about the Grail King, as people would say. Yet, in the midst of his Ciceronian nonsense, Miners inadvertently made a remark which, if correctly interpreted, might have led to important discoveries. He noticed that many points of resemblance are to be found between the ideas of the Parsis and those of the Brahmins and Muslimun. He saw in this a proof that Parsism is a medley of Brahmanical and Muslim tales. Modern scholarship, starting from the same point, came to that twofold conclusion: that on one hand, Parsism was one of the elements out of which Muhammad formed his religion, and on the other hand, that the old religions of India and Persia flowed from a common source. And that's where the truth lies. All the religions flow from a common source, but the priests have made it into something different. Differences in psychology and material culture don't necessitate there being different religions. Certain different applications, but the base teachings. But the 5 tribes, the Aryavatra, became the Hindus and the Persians. So several thousand years ago. But not only does the author of that rubbish tell the same tales of numberless demons of either sex as the Indian priests do, but that he also prescribes in the same remedies in order to drive them away and to balk their attempts. In these words there was something like the germ of comparative mythology. Seldom has a man approached the truth so closely and then departed from it so wildly. So Christian prejudice, rather. It's one thing admitting, okay, the tradition's been corrupted. We don't know, perhaps, how much in places is true or false, even compared to what we have. So let's just, admit that. And I say that too. It's like I share about these various religious texts, and I'm like, a lot of it, I just don't know. What's a translation of a translation, or what's just what the priest came up with. Anquetil and Avesta found an eager champion in the person of Klucker, professor at the University of Riga. As soon as the French translation of the Avesta appeared, he published a German translation of it, and also of Anquetil's historical dissertations. Then, in a series of dissertations of his own, he vindicated the authenticity of the Zend books. Anquetil had already tried to show, in a memoir on Plutarch, that the data of the Avesta fully agrees with the account of the Magian religion given in the treatise on Isis and Osiris. Klucker enlarged the circle of comparison to the whole of the ancient literature. He tried to appeal to the internal evidence, an attempt in which he was less successful. The strength of his defense was seldom greater than the strength of the attack. miners had pointed out that the mythical identity of the Mount Alborg of the Parsis with the Mount Meru of the Hindus as a proof that the Parsis had borrowed their mythology from the Hindus. Well, they both developed their mythology from the same, 5 tribes source, and the same sorts of spiritual entities that involve themselves in that, but the conclusion was incorrect, but the remark itself was not so. Cloquer fancied that he could remove the difficulty by stating that the Mount Alborg is a real mountain, nay, a doubly real mountain, since there are 2 mountains of that name, the one in Persia, the other in Armenia, whereas Mount Meru is only to be found in fairyland. Seldom were worse arguments used in the service of a good cause. Miners had said that the name of the Parsi demons was of Indian origin, as both languages knew them by the Latin name Deus. This was an incorrect statement, and yet an important observation. The word, which means a demon in Persia, means quite the contrary in India, and that radical differences is just a proof of their 2 systems being independent of one another. Cloquer pointed out the incorrectness of the statement, but being unable to account for the identity of the words, he flatly denied it. And not quite independent because reactionary in their very languages, but look at what happened with other things. It's like the Apache and other such things. Well, this is the enemy tribe. Maybe some Native Americans told them that was the enemy tribe, but, using, the language of the invaders and saying that. But Cloquer was more successful in the field of philology. He showed, as Anquetil had done, that Zend has no Arabic elements in it, and that Pahlavi itself, which is more modern than Zend, does not contain any Arabic, but only Semitic words of the Aramean dialect, which are easily accounted for by the close relation of Persia with Aramean lands. In the time of the Sassanian kings, he showed, lastly, that the Arabic words appear only in the very books which the Parsi translation itself considers modern. Rumbly in the tumbly here.